Are there some traits about yourself that you haven't managed to change despite numerous attempts and grueling efforts? Are there processes that you just can't seem to get to work or follow, no matter how hard you try? Are there some external expectations that you just can't seem to meet? There are many examples of such deficiencies. Maybe you are messy, you can't keep your stuff clean and organized. Maybe on the opposite end, you're too rigid, a bit of a neat freak. Maybe you're too lazy and unmotivated, or too focused and distracted. Um, Maybe it's shyness, too introverted, or on the flip side, too out there, energetic, overwhelming. Perhaps you're too meek, you're not assertive or domineering enough. Perhaps it's that too much sensitivity, making a mountain out of molehills. Perhaps you're too inquisitive, you ask too much questions, or you're too odd and you don't fit in, or you're too indecisive, or on the flip side, too stubborn. Anyways, these are a couple of examples, but there's many ways that this can show up. And as time goes on, it feels pretty hopeless. It feels unfair because it's not working. The problem isn't going anywhere, and the frustration and shame are just piling up. So, does this type of situation, does this problem mean that you're doomed? You're just going to stay with this deficiency forever? Well, I don't think that's the real problem, or at least not necessarily. I mean, there might be some part of truth. I'm not saying that there never are cases where it might be a bit too much of a bad trait, so to speak. But overall, I think that a lot of times, or a decent portion of these problems, are mostly due to the tyranny of a single standard that everybody is judged or compared to, or there's like one prevalent and hegemonic way that's depicted as the only way to be and act. And so if you don't match it enough or well enough, well, you're a problem, and you're made to feel ashamed and forced to correct your ways, whether it actually works or not. And that's there's just a general lack of consideration, curiosity, and intellectual flexibility about difference in general in many of our cultures. And it touches on some of the ideas I've mentioned in previous video, like the quote about the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result, which is attributed incorrectly to Einstein. But that's kind of what happens when you try to force people to be in a way that they just can't manage to be. Like, if it's not working, it doesn't create better results, and it creates additional suffering. So it's pretty dysfunctional and ineffective. And sadly, it's pretty prevalent out there that the culture isn't really about trying to figure something out and meeting in the middle. And that's, mostly an exception, or depends on the cases, but it's often more about who can get the other to break and comply to their way of doing things. So I think that's really the real problem. And, as a caveat, I don't think there's anything wrong with wanting to change and improve yourself, as long as the impetus for this change comes from yourself. This is something you want to be different. And you're not just, bonsaiing yourself, kind of shrinking and twisting yourself in ways that you don't really aspire to, just as a mean to escape external bullying. That's not really self-improvement, it's just blackmail. And so I think that this concept of the single standard is pretty flawed. There's this, common story, and also another misquote, or wrongly attributed quote to Einstein about, like a fish being judged for its ability to climb a tree, and that's being a pretty silly thing to do. Of course, the fish is going to be, judged or get a pretty low score, but it would fare a lot better in a context where it actually thrives, like the ocean. But in general, a good thing to keep in mind is that everything is a trade-off, and every pro, every benefit to something or someone or a way of being it comes at the cost of a con or a disadvantage in a different context. And a lot of our organization in society is based on roles. Um, in sports, you have, especially in team sports, you have different types of roles. Some players are more oriented for offense, others for defense. Different body types are better suited for different types of play. Even in single player sports, you have different strengths and weaknesses that play better to certain styles and others. In video games, you have different types of role. Famous ones are, DPS, tank, and healer. But and even in society and within a company, you have many different roles that you need, and or even a big part of the economical success in the world is through the diversification of specialists. So, like if one person specializes and gets really good at doing one thing, then they basically get way better at producing that one thing, and trading it with another specialist reaps better results than if everybody was doing a little bit of everything, just a lot less efficiently. But anyway, so since everything is a trade-off and every way of being is a trade-off, it's good to have a lot of difference so that you have a person or a way of doing that works well whenever a new context arises. In general, diversity is a winning evolutionary strategy. And actually, it's also a winning investment strategy. But because basically you don't want to put all your eggs in the same baskets, and you want to have ways to handle new problems, new scenarios. There is a good Ishmael quote on this topic. It goes, "Diversity is a survival factor for the community itself. A community of 100 million species can survive almost anything short of total global catastrophe. Within that 100 million will be thousands that could survive a global temperature drop of 20 degrees, which would be a lot more devastating than it sounds. Within that 100 million will be thousands that could survive a global temperature rise of 20 degrees. But a community of 100 species or 1,000 species has almost no survival value at all." So basically, what I'm trying to say is that having a lot of different ways of doing things and difference is basically good, and and finding ways to harness the difference in a productive way is important. So what's the alternative to having just a single standard where a lot of people are not going to be a good fit for it? If you think about it, right, if you're playing a game of cards and everybody's got a different hand, well, you're going to need different types of strategy based on the hand you got. If everybody tried to use the exact same strategy without taking into account the current state of the game and the hand they have, they're probably not going to be doing very well. So having a unique strategy that doesn't react to the specific context is absurd. And so that's why thinking about things in terms of like a couple or a few archetypes is superior to a single standard. Like finding, it doesn't need to be completely exhaustive, but just having a couple of archetypes, like a couple of different ways that are generally considered for doing something, and finding the one that matches yours best and trying to learn from it is a way better method of going about things. Finding so they serve kind of two purposes. On one hand, you can improve your self-understanding because you kind of observe and assess your strengths and weaknesses, and you can kind of try and understand or see which archetypes you fit in to most, or you correspond to most, rather than just kind of losing energy in shame and repressing what's natural for you. And then you can try and find the right role, the right that you want to embody based on your profile, and the best type of environment for this type of profile, right? Because again, like a lot of these traits that you have might be a problem in specific types of contexts, but they could actually be a big boon in a different context. So kind of changing to find the right environments for your skills and flaws is also important. And then finding the best strategies that worked based on your profile. And like, yeah, archetypes can be a big source of liberation. Basically seeing that there's different ways to go about things, and just having the examples of a couple of different paths in contrast to just this one single standard can have a big impact. And I think that like what really drove this point home for me was a little archetype system, you could say, that's on the topic of how you organize mostly your house. Like how do you declutter and keep things tidy, which is called Clutterbug, and it's based on 4 archetypes, which are based on 2 polarities or dichotomies. So one dichotomy is about people who prefer to see things, or very visual, who like abundance, and other people who get overwhelmed when there's too much abundance of stuff, and they prefer to kind of keep it hidden and out of view. And then the second dichotomy is people who kind of like organized, intricate systems versus people who prefer simple and easy to remember systems that are pretty fast. So with those 2 polarities, or we get 4 profiles in total. The people who prefer to have visual abundance and a lot of organization, which the author calls B. The people who prefer visual abundance and fast and loose systems, which are called butterflies in the system, because it's all based on on bug names. And then the people who prefer hidden and organized, which are called cricket, and people who prefer hidden and fast and easy, which are called ladybugs. So a pretty simple system. And based on these different systems, there are different strategies that the author proposes, which work best for these different types of people. As in, like, it will keep things tidy, and it will actually work. Like, it's things that these people can actually do reliably and consistently. So it's a pretty interesting system, but it's pretty simplistic. And when I was watching the videos, I started reading the comments, and people were expressing, like a lot of relief from figuring out the system. Like, I'll read you some extracts from comments. So one person said, "I have always felt like I was a mess and something was wrong with me because all of my family and friends were coming to my home or room when I lived at home and would say, 'How do you live like this?' I would cry every time." Another person says, "I'm so glad I found this. Thank you for letting me know there's nothing wrong with me and that it is possible to be organized without feeling like I'm dying inside." Another one says, "This 10-minute video has changed my life forever. I'm a 40-year butterfly who has felt like a failure for 20 years. Yeah, to give a bit of context, butterflies are as a archetype of organization that is the most associated with messiness. So they tend to be the one that feel the most relief, who feel the most shame by default, and then the most relief when they find the systems and way in which they can be more organized. So a couple of other tidbits of comments. Another one said, "You made me tear up. I grew up with an uber-organized mom and 2 uber-organized sisters. I was told growing up, why can't you keep your room clean? You have too much stuff. Why do you have so much stuff?" I know I have been a butterfly and have started improving on my organization thanks to you for the past year and a half. Another said, "Thank you for this. I nearly cried watching this video." If I kind of move on a little bit in the comment, "I've been watching and reading all this organizing stuff meant for other types of people and shaming myself for not being able to fit in with them. No more of that." Another person noted that, "Doesn't it seem counterintuitive how helpful and what a relief a diagnosis is? Thank you so much for your new explanation." And last one said, "Seriously, I know everyone else has said this, but you have just blown my mind. It's like 15 years of frustration explained." And it was so when I read that, I was pretty surprised at how profound of an impact this system had. Like, I found it interesting because, I was like, oh, there's a couple of tips I can learn from this and use from it. But from some people, it had like a big emotional impact. And it's a pretty simple system, it's only got 4 types. It's not any complicated, like, it's got no scientific basis or anything. It's just like someone who, over time observing people, figured out a core few patterns, and then based on these patterns and a couple of categories, figured out strategies that work best for each. And just that was like a big shift and a big relief and liberation for many of these people. And I think that's like the power of different archetypes, of like figuring out a couple of different ways people tend to, cluster towards or around, and then figuring out how you can work given, that set of traits. And I know I've had similar experiences, especially when I was in my early 20s. Like for a while, I felt like I couldn't follow the only path that had been set for me as a standard, or at least, that seemed like that was the only way to do things. And I just didn't feel like it had that I had what it took to do it. So it felt pretty hopeless, and I didn't really know how to, move on in the future, as I was, starting to, having to start to create my own life. And at that time in my life, I discovered a life path archetype system, which in retrospect or in hindsight was admittedly a pretty flawed system. I don't use it anymore. But nevertheless, it opened up the realm of possibilities, because there were, I don't remember how many types there were in that system, but many, probably at least 10. And they all had different ways. It was pretty centered on personal development and kind of, figuring out your life. And so just seeing the abundance, the different ways, and finding some that were a way better match for me, or that felt way more doable than what I had come to understand was the way you were supposed to do to go about things, was really liberating and a big source of relief. And since then, I like these types of systems and frameworks, and I've collected quite a few, and used and learned many. And there's different frameworks that contrast different mindsets, values, and ways of approaching situations. They've helped me with time to deepen my self-knowledge, better harness some of my strengths, or better realize that there are strengths. Because that's another thing too. We tend to underestimate what we're good at, because it just feels very natural to us. So not only, and then we overfocus on what we kind of are not so good at. And also, better address some of the weaknesses, at least the one that I wanted to improve upon. And I think that this might be the true power of personality typology or archetype frameworks. And, in slightly different but similar vibes, you have, for example, the love languages, which isn't really about a type of personality, but more types of communication, or types of valuing the expression of love. And so I think that the real value of the system is not necessarily as a perfect representation of reality, as in like, this is definitely how things happen, there are only these categories, or people only fit a specific way, this according to these specific rules. But rather, their value comes as being a vector of inspiration for people to learn to play with their own strengths, and opening up the field of possibility, and discovering new landscapes of quirks and custom strategies that are tailored for them. And so, I think that as someone who's interested in understanding myself better and in harmonious coexistence in general, I think that, that these systems can be very helpful. So if you found this video interesting, you might want to check out some of the other videos I made, especially on the topic of discipline, because I also talk a little bit about this topic of like systems that don't work, and actually working with the way you're naturally geared, and finding strategies that work in spite of that. So, for example, I think that my video on familiarity breeds headway would be might be of interest. And then I'm planning to do more videos on personality typologies, and kind of making an overview of different systems I like. Thanks for listening. Don't hesitate to ask questions if you have some. And see you in the next video.